My sermon this morning is based upon the gospel lesson that Kim just read for us, the story of Jesus healing a woman with a debilitating disease. Every United Church of Christ pastor is expected to abide by the ministerial code of conduct, a document that provides guidance as to how we may live a life worthy of our calling. The code speaks of our conduct in the home, in the community, and in the congregation. And of particular relevance to the sermon today is its guidance on treating all members of the congregation in an equal manner. It reads, and I quote, "I covenant with God to preach and teach the gospel without fear or favor, regarding all persons with equal respect and concern, and undertaking to minister impartially." End of quote. The code doesn't prohibit the pastor from liking some parishioners better than others, but it does say that the pastor's ministry should be available equally to everyone in the parish. Or in the imagery of our gospel lesson, where Jesus saw a woman with a debilitating illness, the minister should see everyone, should be attentive to everyone's needs, burdens, and blessings. Seeing people is important. I mentioned in an earlier sermon how an employee at First Congregational Church in Lebanon helped me see people in the community I could not see without his help. Our new custodian was part of a community of individuals who struggled with addiction and its related problems of poor health, homelessness, and abuse. Jim helped me to see his friends hiding in plain sight, sitting in the library, on park benches, or walking to and from an abandoned railroad tunnel nearby. He would tell me of their problems and ask me to pray for them when they were in crisis. I've also mentioned how my granddaughter helped me to take notice, to see the needs of a homeless person sitting on a trafficked island separating the lanes of traffic in Concord. In the course of a busy life, it's all too easy to not see or notice people living at the edges. And not being seen is a common concern for those in the differently abled community. Many who write online about life with a disability speak of alienation or indifference or even blaming on the part of friends and family. They speak of challenges in getting with accessibility into buildings that are important for their well-being. They speak of insensitive comments and questions from strangers and friends alike, of difficulty in finding a workplace that accommodates their needs, the challenges of obtaining the kind of medical care that will enable them to live more productive lives. And if these challenges are present in modern-day prosperous America, we can be quite sure they were true for the unnamed and largely unnoticed woman in Jesus' time, who sat with the others in Jesus' class at synagogue. As Luke notes, her illness meant that she was severely bent over. In the Greek, it speaks of one whose illness is so great that one is almost doubled over from the effects of the illness. And one cannot help but wonder what her view of the world was like, what she saw as she walked bent over through life. One can imagine that she would enjoy and see flowers and maybe the smiles of little children. One can imagine she would not see many smiling faces from adults or be able to behold the beauty of the summer's blue sky. And many would not see her. Indeed, we may assume that few paid attention to her as she entered the synagogue on that Sabbath. They knew her well enough to know that she had been ill for some 18 years, but not well enough to give her a name. But Jesus notices her, and without much ado, calls her over, beckons her to come, lays his hand upon her, and in a moment she is released from the grip of a deeply debilitating illness. She is set free, and now the gospel writer says she stands up completely straight and begins immediately praising God. It is a beautiful moment for several reasons. We glimpse the sensitivity and compassion of Jesus. We watch Jesus access divine power in a way that benefits a person in great need, a wonderful example of the right use of power. And we hear a grateful woman's voice lifting up in thanksgiving and praise to God. Teresa Berger, writing in a 2004 Christian Century article, sees in the woman's bent over body a powerful metaphor for women's experience. She writes, and I quote, "Global forces are constraining women's lives as never before. Although the world's population continues to grow, the number of women is declining. Already there are 60 to 100 million fewer girls than boys in the world due to selective abortions, selective infanticide or neglect, and the uneven allocation of basic resources such as food, health care, and education to girls." And she continues, "The battering of women results in more injuries requiring medical attention than auto accidents, muggings, and rapes combined." And then there are the cultural forces that bend women's bodies through cosmetic surgery, clothing, or obsessive forms of dieting. End of quote. And while we might hope that the modern day followers of Jesus would be leading the fight for greater freedom and protection from harm, few within the church are actually doing much to support women's release from society's constraints. Even the very progressive United Church of Christ has struggled to be fair and equitable to its women leaders, as both statistics and personal stories bear out. The forces that bend and constrain the lives and bodies of women are alive and well. In returning to Luke's story, we find that the warm feelings, the rejoicing of the people is beginning to fade away as the president of the synagogue berates the crowd. It's interesting that he's angry with Jesus for healing on the Sabbath, but he berates the crowd. It's a curious twist of behavior. But challenges for Jesus around the meaning of Sabbath are not unusual. His theology of Sabbath was often at odds with that of his fellow rabbis. Rolf Jacobson, an Old Testament professor at Luther Seminary, notes in his comments upon this lesson that Sabbath is designed to, quote, get one out of bed. No, I'm sorry, back up a bit. Sabbath is designed to interrupt the get out of bed and get to work cycle, to interrupt that cycle with rest, renewal, and freedom from work's demands. Curiously, the president of the synagogue hasn't called out Jesus for teaching on the Sabbath, which, as any teacher or teacher's family knows, is hard work. He chooses to call him out for quietly, discreetly, and compassionately inviting God's power into the life of a deeply disabled woman, releasing her from the grip of her illness. And for Jesus, liberating someone from a lifetime of physical disability is quite in keeping with the Sabbath. And so he challenges his accuser, giving it right back, calling him out for his hypocrisy. "You hypocrite," Jesus says. "You'll care for your oxen and your donkeys on the Sabbath, leading them to water. Is not this daughter of Abraham worthy of your care?" And the crowd, like Jesus, paid little attention to the synagogue president's rebuke and joined the woman in rejoicing and praising God, perhaps with words like those from our call to worship this morning. "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless God's holy name." Our pastor at Hopkinton, where Nirmala and I are members, has been using her sermons in August to encourage the congregation to engage in contemplative practice. And one of the practices she is recommending comes from the Jesuits, from the writings of Ignatius, and is simply called the daily examen, E-X-A-M-E-N. The examen provides a structure for quiet reflection at the end of the day, inviting one to recall and name the blessings, small and large, that one has enjoyed that day. It then proceeds to a prayer for guidance, a review of the day's challenges and disappointments, and a time of prayer for the coming day. And I've practiced the examen often over the years, and have found that slowing my mind down enough so that I can name the ways in which my life is blessed, and reflecting upon the ways in which I may have experienced God's presence that day is time well spent. It reminds us that we are body, soul, and spirit, and that attending to our whole self is a good thing. Further, the examen has a way of encouraging within one's heart and mind a culture of gratitude, something that in itself enhances our way of seeing how our lives are blessed. And had our disabled woman healed by Jesus been in the practice of doing the examen, I'm sure she would have had more than a few blessings to name at the end of her day in the synagogue with Jesus. In discussing this lesson on the Working Preacher podcast, Dr. Rolf Jacobson, earlier mentioned from Luther Seminary, reflects briefly on the life of Nelson Mandela. You'll remember that Mandela was incarcerated for some 27 years in some of South Africa's worst prisons. For many years, his days were spent breaking apart rocks, creating gravel, and mining lime under the beating South African sun. And yet, as difficult as life was, and as hopeless as his circumstances seemed to be, he refused offers of liberty, of release from prison, out of a principled belief that apartheid needed to end. He couldn't be free unless all his people were free from the, quote, bending over of their souls and bodies through apartheid's harsh inequalities. And when Mandela was finally released, he devoted his life to leading his nation toward a more equitable and just society, developing programs to eradicate poverty, to improve health care, and to provide a forum for dealing with apartheid's legacy of grievances and injustices through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mandela's release from bondage, his gradual unbending from the constraints of imprisonment, released from within him gifts that brought blessings to his people and praise to his God. And he is remembered and honored today as a father of that great nation. You know, we may never ourselves know bondage of the kind experienced by the woman in Luke's gospel. We may never know the kind of bondage that Mandela faced in South Africa's prisons. But we are aware of situations even now where foreign policy decisions by our government and its allies are binding and constraining good people. Last evening, I watched in horror a PBS NewsHour article on the war in Gaza, an article that focused on the famine and starvation that is part of Israel's plan to bring Hamas to its knees in surrender. My eyes beheld the emaciated bodies of little children, even as I heard U.S. and Israeli leaders say that reports of famine and starvation are false. Reporter John Yang interviewed Chris McIntosh, a staff member with Oxfam. Oxfam, you may know, is a highly respected relief organization that has been working to address poverty and hunger for some 80 years and works in 75 different countries. And he reported that Israel has refused to provide Oxfam with the credentials needed to bring food and medical supplies into Gaza, in spite of Oxfam having millions of dollars of supplies, worth of supplies stationed at the border. And after describing the hopelessness of the situation, of seeing people starve while his organization is being denied the ability to help, Mr. McIntosh said something remarkably Christ-like. He was asked what we might do about the situation in Gaza, and he responded, knowing he was addressing an American audience, by saying that, quote, "This is one of those dark moments we read about in our history books." And he continued, "Periods of darkness are an invitation to be the light that leads us out of that darkness. To be," he continued, "the country that we tell ourselves we are. To be the country that we want to be. And ultimately, to be the country that we should be." End of quote. He then went on to encourage the calling and writing of our representatives as a way of helping. But we must acknowledge that neither party has shown any willingness to risk acting courageously to bring about an end to this awful and horrifying bending of the bodies of men, women, and children in Gaza. Their willful acquiescence to famine and starvation is, I believe, a moral failure of the highest order. My friends, this is a time for being light in darkness, a time for bringing hope into despair. While we may wonder just what our little witness can do in this world of darkness. May we find inspiration in the example of Nelson Mandela, or in the words of Chris McIntosh, or even as with a woman healed of disease, in our times of worship as we express gratitude for the lives we are privileged to live, lives of safety and comfort far from the places of danger in our world. May we, with that woman from Jesus' synagogue, continually say to ourselves, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all God's benefits." Amen.